Hello.
Good
Today I wanted to
morning.
do a special one-off topic on the subject of demographics. Let me share my screen. Okay, let's see if we can expand this. All right, a couple Bible verses first. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it." Genesis 1:28. And then after the flood, he tells Noah and his descendants, "Be fruitful and multiply on the earth." Someone once told me these are the only commandments God gave that men ever obeyed. And maybe you could say that's true, but maybe not recently. The world population has grown rapidly, especially in recent years. Until very recently, the growth rate has slowed, and it's going to continue to slow for some time and probably peak this century and then begin to decline, which would really be something new in world history. This particular estimate on this chart is provided by the United Nations. There are other people who've done estimates. This estimate, where the world population goes to 10 billion, is the highest estimate you'll get. The other ones are all lower with earlier peaks. Now, there was a group of people called Malthusians who were worried about population growth and using up all the Earth's resources. And that's something they taught for a while. That's still kind of a strong going idea. But population growth has never been actually really a problem. Um, we're going to soon have population decline. We're already having it in some places, and that is going to be a problem. This particular problem, I've known since China adopted the one-child policy way back in the 1980s. I remember thinking that that was actually a bad idea, but any kind of problem that it produced was always going to be well in the future. And so it's in the future until recently, and now this problem is beginning to be felt in different places in the world. Some overall features of demographics. If you're going to make predictions about the future are always dangerous and risky. However, demographic predictions are a sure thing. If you need more 25-year-olds next year, you can't have them because you've got to go. The only way to do it is to go back in time 25 years and have babies, and you can't do it. So demographics are sure, but the change is very slow. In order to really be felt, it might take a lifetime or more. And like I said, the impacts have not really been noticeable until recently. Although for a while now, we've had a shrinking number of children. Children don't add much to like an economy or a military or et cetera. But now, in a lot of different places, this is beginning to have an effect. I wanted to talk about that a little bit. The demographics are beginning to drive a decline in multiple places around the world. Talk about the magic number, 2. Theoretically, that's the number of children per woman you got to have for a steady population. No growth, no shrinkage. 2 parents have 2 children. Those 2 children have 2 more children. In theory, if everybody continued like that forever, you would have a steady population, always keeping the same size. In practice, the magic number is really 2.1 because not all female children will live to childbearing age. So 2.1 is the important number. If you've got more than 2.1 children per woman, that means that you're going to have population growth in the long term. Less than 2.1 means population decline in the long term. Let me talk about the concept of a population pyramid. This is a population pyramid for the country of Kenya, which is a rapidly growing country which still has a high fertility rate, well over 2.1. Their rate is 3.4, so a lot of children per woman. And in this population pyramid, you have down at the bottom, it says 0 to 4 years old, and that's the widest part down there at the bottom. There's more Kenyans age 0 to 4 than anything else. And you go on up the pyramid, so you have, the old folks around 70 to 74. And of course, it gets to be a smaller and smaller number as people at the top of the pyramid die off. So it's called a pyramid. It looks like a pyramid. And we can't go too far without talking about a country like the United States, where I am from. And in the United States, you can see it doesn't look much like a pyramid at all. It looks almost like a rocket or something till you get toward the top where people begin to die off. But the number of people who are 60 to 64 is about the same as the number of people who are 0 to 4. So this sort of indicates you've got no growth, but no real shrinkage. The fertility rate in the United States is 1.64, so it's well below 2.1. It was above 2.1 until some rather few years ago, but now it's below that. And so at that rate, we would expect to see eventually, like I say, it's going to take a long time, but you would expect to see the population begin to shrink. In the United States, it's not likely to shrink for quite a long time, primarily because we have that positive net immigration. We have immigrants coming in from the southern border and other places. That's likely to cause the country to continue to grow in population, even if the fertility rate isn't very high. But the other reason that the United States is not going to shrink very fast is that the shape of that rocket, as you can see, although it's almost straight. It's almost a straight line coming down each side. So it's not for quite a while that you would expect the population to begin to actually shrink. The problem we have in the United States is that as the population grows and gets older, the older folks are in the red box up there, about 60 up through end of life. And those people tend to not work. Whereas the people in the green box, they do work. And the people in the green box will need to support the people in the old box, whether they support them directly or by paying taxes. The people in green box are going to support the people in the red box. And as the number of people in the red box grows, that makes it difficult for the economy because the economy has to pay more and more money to support old people who aren't really working, who aren't really adding anything to the economy. That's the problem that we've been seeing on the horizon in the United States for a while. It hasn't really hurt us yet. Someday it will, hard to say exactly when. Let's look at a much worse example. This is China. Their fertility rate is down to 1.28. This is largely because they imposed about 40 years ago a one child per woman mandatory policy. They were worried that their population was growing too fast, and so they forced people to have only one child per woman. Now, the result is this isn't a pyramid at all. The group there of 0 to 4-year-olds is a very small group. You don't get that small an age group until you go all the way up to the 70-year-olds. So the number of 70-year-olds is about the same as the number of 1-year-olds in China. And so in China, the group in the middle, the fattest part of this graph, that moves on up as the years go on out. And if I were to draw a red box and a green box for China, it would look much worse than for the United States. And as years progress, it will look worse still. Their one-child policy caused awkward situations sometimes where there was sex-selective abortion and that sort of thing. So they have an uneven number of males to females. In China, the population has already peaked. For my whole life, China had the largest population in the world until a year or two ago, and now India has the largest population in the world. The working age population in China peaked in 2017. Now, since China is such an engine of economic growth across the world, that makes a big deal. The older folks are not in the working population. They don't really add to China's economy or the world economy, but the working age people do. But that population peaked in 2017. This is a projection of China's future population. As you can see, they are almost at the top right now, but they've started to come down, and they're going to continue to come down for quite a long time. Is this a sure prediction? Well, not completely, because we can't say how many babies they're going to have in the future, but you can say for sure that the number of 80-year-olds that they have in the year 2100 is, those people have already been born, and it's not that many in relation to what the overall population. I mentioned India. We've just got to put a graph of India up because India is the largest country in the world now by population. And you can see it's a little bit more of a pyramid there for India. Their fertility rate is 2.05, so it's almost at that magic number 2.1. It's a little bit below it. In Europe, every country in Europe has a fertility rate below 2.1, well below 2.1. That problem is masked a little bit by immigration, so they don't have a lot of declining population, but the immigration primarily comes from North Africa and the Middle East, and those people are Muslims almost entirely. And the fertility rate for Muslims in Europe is 2.54, so it's well above replacement rate. So this has implications to the demographics of Europe, basically that the countries in Europe are going to be trending more Muslim than they are now. I wouldn't jump up and down and get too excited about this. The number of Muslims in Europe is still a pretty small minority compared to the overall population. And like I said at the beginning of this presentation, demographics works slowly. But long term, this is going to be a problem. This is Europe's fertility on a different kind of graph. And it lists some of the countries in Europe. And as you can see, none of them today are above 2.1. France seems to be 1.84. That's the highest number in the European Union. Everybody else is less. Every developed country in Asia has a fertility rate below 2.1. Japan, China, Taiwan, South Korea, the lowest in the world. In Japan, they've had a pretty low fertility rate, and it's making a real difference. Their population peaked in about 2008. But if you roll back to about 1990, you can see that the greenish part on this graph, that is their working age population, 15 to 64. That population peaked in 1990 or so. So quite a long time ago. Now, I'm old enough to remember in 1990 that there was a great deal of talk about Japan being the rising economic engine and how they would eventually perhaps overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world. Seems a little bit strange today to think that people were talking about that back then, but they really were. There was quite a bit of that. But the reason it was completely impossible for it ever actually to happen is that the number of workers in Japan had peaked out and was inevitably going to shrink. In the United States, we sometimes think about the Latin American countries which are sending immigrants in having a high birth rate, but the largest Latin American countries also have a fertility rate below 2.1. I've showed them there. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. There are some exceptions. They're mostly among the poorer countries. Venezuela, Peru, and Bolivia, for example, are a little bit higher. This is a graph showing global fertility rates. Back in 1960, they were around 5, and they've dropped to where they're now less than half. Why is this happening? What's the reason for the decline? Some examples that have been given are industrialization, access to birth control and abortion, the addition of more women who are working, women in the workforce, advanced education for women, women having children later in life, And even some people have suggested the high cost of living, people saying, I just can't afford to have another child. However, now I got to pull up the exception here. Every one of those factors I just mentioned is present in Israel, but their fertility rate is 2.9. So everybody else in the developed world has a fertility rate that's very low, below 2, and Israel's fertility rate is almost 3. And in case anybody's wondering, Israel has a fairly sizable Islamic minority, but the rate for fertility rate for Arabs and Jews is the same. They're both 2.9 in Israel. Here's an example that shows Israel compared to all the other developed countries, and they're way, way ahead. And this is really the same kind of graph showing all the developed countries in the world with South Korea on the far left in red and Israel on the far right, way above everybody else, which is kind of interesting. Why is this? All those characteristics which I mentioned before are really present in Israel, but they just have a different culture that they want to have more children. They want to because they want to. Here's a quote from an Israeli. We definitely need more money and we have rising expenses, the guy says, but I want a large family and the cost of living won't stop us. This is Lieutenant Colonel Or Ben Yehuda, Israel Defense Forces. Now, in Israel, women are drafted into the military, but not too many of them go into combat units. But there are a few who do. There are a few mixed combat units in the Israeli army. And this particular lady not only went into a combat unit, but stayed in the army and became a professional officer. Now she's a lieutenant colonel. And I was reading an article where they interviewed her, and she was talking about how she got suddenly thrown into combat on October 7 when a war broke out, when Hamas attacked Israel. And she was in a battle in an unusual situation. And the guy asked her, were you thinking of anything other than the battle? And she said, yes, I thought of my children. I have 3. And I remember thinking, that was really surprising to me. If there was anyone who you would think would not necessarily have a lot of kids, it would be a female combat officer. But she had 3. She said they were staying with the grandparents. Some people may recognize this. This is Wonder Woman. That's Gal Gadot, who's probably the most famous Israeli female actress. And so if someone playing a role like that and a famous actress, if there's anybody that might have few children, it might be somebody like that. But just as I was preparing this presentation, I saw this thing in the news. She welcomed her 4th baby. She's got 4 little girls there with her husband. So everybody seems to want to have children. They just want to because they do. Now, aside from whatever else you might think about all of that, here's a ramification that maybe we hadn't really considered before. This is that population pyramid again. And if you look at the 18 to 22-year-olds, I tried to put a red bar around it. It might be up slightly too high, but that's the age of conscripts in the Israeli standing army. So they're drafted in at that age. That's what it looks like for, that's the part of the population pyramid that will be drafted. Reservists can be older, but that's the age at which you're drafted. Now, compare that to Ukraine. I pulled up Ukraine because Israel and Ukraine both now in a war, and it's not really apples to apples at all the kind of war they're in. I know that. I don't want to make an invalid comparison, but I did want to look at Ukraine's population pyramid. As you can see, this is probably a very unhealthy pyramid. Their fertility rate is a very low 1.22. It's also warped a little bit by they've had immigration out of the country in the past. But this would be that same age if they were drafting the same people that the Israelis were drafting. but it's such a small slice of the population, and they are actually not drafting that age. They're drafting people from an older age. So much so that I saw an article, I found it a little hard to believe that the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43. I'm not sure that I believe that, but if so, that would be too old. Um, Now, I'm not saying this as a moral criticism of the Ukrainians or anything like that. I don't want to bring anything into this other than just this is a subject of um, demographics. But this is a demographic problem. Of course, Ukraine is under terrible pressure by Russia, which doesn't have a very good population pyramid itself either, but Russia is much larger, of course. And part of the reason that Ukraine is under pressure is because the available people to serve in their army is it's not an entirely healthy situation for their country. It would really be something if they were to lose their country, and I hope they don't, because they didn't have enough soldiers. And if we talk about other people who might be under pressure militarily, we worry about China and Taiwan. Taiwan has a very low fertility rate too. This graph has a little bit of a different look, but you can see the same sort of thing. It's the young ones down there, 20 to 24, who would be the teeth of the army right now. If you roll the years forward about 4 years, it's that lower group, 15 to 19, a much smaller group. So Taiwan's army rolling into the future looks like it's set to shrink, or at least the number of people available for military service will continue to shrink into the future. Or South Korea, the very worst ones of all, they are under some pressure because the North Koreans are such a poor neighbor. But it was never something we worried about too much because South Korea had a large and modern army compared to the North Koreans. But look at their population pyramid. As the years go forward, their people available for military service shrink more and more. Now, what's the implication for Christians? You might want to look at those pyramids of the United States and Europe and think that's, doesn't necessarily bode well for Christians, but I just had to pull this up as a comparison. There's not too many countries in the world that name themselves as a Christian country officially, but Zambia does, and they have one of the highest fertility rates in the world. They're at 4.83. So at least in Africa, there are a number of majority Christian countries right now who have very large fertility rates. I think one of the things we have to just remember going out of it is that what the Bible says is true in Psalms 127. It doesn't always seem like this, but it says, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gates. That's Psalms 123, 127, and it should say verses 3 through 5 there. So anyway, that's my topic on demographics. I thought it was interesting because it's got to the point now where it's making a difference in the world. So I thought it was something worth talking about.